It is often acknowledged in the citizenship literature that there is a built-in paradox to citizenship. Even though citizenship in liberal democracies seems to aspire to universalistic principles, freedoms and rights, as well as privileges, citizenship only applies to those considered to be members of a political community. To refer to the inherently exclusionary nature of citizenship, some scholars suggest that citizenship is soft on the inside, hard on the outside. One of the purposes of this presentation will be to interrogate this notion of citizenship, the notion of citizenship at the current historical moment, when we live simultaneously with neoliberalism on the one hand and conservatism on the other, as two main political and ideological forces that seem to be shaping the body politic. I will make the argument that the present historical moment is one when citizenship is hardened both on the inside and on the outside. A second purpose of the paper will be to bring two literatures on citizenship, often not studied together, side by side. There seems to be some kind of a parallax gap between studies looking at the outside of citizenship into immigration, citizenship, and multiculturalism issues, and those studies looking at the inside, for example, into changes in the nature of citizenship with retreat from the welfare state. Except for some critical race scholarship, for example, in the works of Sunira Tobani in her book on exalted subjects, or the book by Grace Chang, Disposable Domestics, most scholarship seems to treat the inside and the outside of citizenship as separate and rather unrelated fields. Worse, there is also a strong body of discourse in academic as well as political talk, especially in Europe, which sees the welfare state and liberal immigration and refugee policies and multiculturalism as inherently and necessarily incompatible with one another. The logic of this argument, which sees the welfare state and liberal citizenship and immigration policies as incompatible with one another, is that the sense of solidarity that has led to the development of the post-war welfare state in Europe was based on what was considered a thick cultural identity, which could only exist among people who descended from those living in a country for many generations. This perspective is rather deterministic as well as culturally reductionist. These arguments can easily lead to blaming the dismantling of the welfare state on ethnic, racial, and cultural diversity in a society, overlooking decades or even centuries of class antagonisms in Europe among people now assumed to have a thick cultural identity. This perspective also overlooks the combined aspects and effects of neoliberalism and conservatism simultaneously hardening the inside and the outside of citizenship. The late Stuart Hall, who has just died in the recent period, was one of the first to analyze the emergence of a politics that combined conservatism and neoliberalism. Referring to Thatcherism as a form of authoritarian populism, Stuart Hall argued in the late 1970s and the 1980s that Thatcherism, in unquote, has managed to stitch up or unify the contradictory strands in its discourse. The resonant themes of organic Toryism, nation, family, duty, authority, standards, traditionalism, patriarchalism, with the aggressive themes of a revived neoliberalism, self-interest, competitive individualism, anti-statism. End of quote. We can argue that while conservatism helps to re-racialize the boundaries of the nation, neoliberalism helps undermine claims to equality and distributive justice. Even as conservatism claims to thicken citizenship by emphasizing national history and culture, both neoliberalism and conservatism tend to thin citizenship and to scarcify it. I don't know whether the word scarcify exists in the dictionary, but I came up with that term. To thin they both tend to thin citizenship and to scarcify it, both in the inside and the outside. In the rest of the presentation, I will first be talking about hardening of citizenship on the outside, and then talk about how citizenship is also hardening on the inside. And then I will be talking about the political and ideological relationship between the hardening on the outside and in the inside by looking at the state of citizenship at the current moment. Let's first focus on some of the ways in which citizenship is hardening on the outside. That is, for those people who do not yet have it or who are not seen to have the identity of citizenship. Before we talk about the specific ways in which this happens, I think it is important to see the context in which it is happening and to recognize that questions on immigration and multiculturalism are starting to receive such significant attention when they become the last bastion of sovereignty, in a way, for states. As states in a period of economic corporate globalization are losing the power to make independent decisions on behalf of the citizenry on many matters of social and public policy, it seems that immigration and multiculturalism become the focus of attention, almost to a point of obsession. There seems to be two major ways, I will suggest, in which the outside of citizenship is hardening. First, increasingly we find that there are restrictive immigration and refugee policies and practices, as well as settlement policies and practices, where these practices and policies scarcify full legal status, rights, and identity of citizenship, and deny them to many people. Secondly, citizenship seems to be hardening on the outside by conservative as well as liberal discourses, which are tending to re-nationalize and to be more precise, re-racialize citizenship. Let us open up both of these two dimensions. First, to talk about some of the restrictive policies of immigration and policies pertaining to immigration, refugees, as well as to settlement in the specific context of Canada, we can easily argue that in the last few decades, there have not only been more restrictive policies brought in relation to selection of immigrants in general, but there have been specifically restrictive policies in relation to, for example, family class immigrants or refugees in the form of the recent Bill C-31 and so on. As significant as state policies and practices are, there are also some very negative and offensive discourses used by governments, the media, as well as sometimes the larger public, that bombard refugees and immigrants with messages of criminality, unwantedness, and undeservedness. Specifically, there has been an onslaught of negativeness, a proliferation of language, delegitimizing refugees and immigrants in the last two and a half decades. Terms such as bogus refugees, jumping the queue, being a burden on the system, often used in relation to refugees or sponsored family members. Having different civilizational values, or being security threats, or even terrorists. This kind of language has become extremely common in recent years and decades. In relation to settlements, we can argue that the challenges facing immigrants, including those immigrants who are in the desired categories of immigration, have been extremely difficult, even though the governments have claimed to be looking into questions of accreditation. Accreditation challenges as well as systemic racism still seem to be creating enormous obstacles for immigrants in a number of different ways. Other than restrictive policies and negative discourses, it is important to mention that the great expansion in immigration categories, which deny full legal status and associated rights to increasing numbers of migrants, is a very important development. And here I'm referring specifically to the incredible expansion, especially since 2006, in the category of temporary migrant status in Canada. It is important to recognize that the anti-immigrant discourses and discourses that declare immigrants as unwanted people in the country may seem contradictory to their desirability as a vulnerable and exploitable source of labor to employers. Some critical theorists have highlighted that even though these two things, the unwantedness of immigrants on the one hand, or migrants on the one hand, and their desirability to employers as exploitable and especially vulnerable source of labor, may sound contradictory, that the two actually often go together. Ghassan Haj argues, for example, that, quote, anti-immigrant discourse, by continually constructing the immigrants as unwanted, works precisely at maintaining their economic viability to employers. They are best wanted, he says, as unwanted. It is important to see how the expansion in recent years, especially in the category of temporary migrant labor, in Canada actually contributes in significant ways to legitimizing practices that would otherwise be considered racializing practices. As Ramirez and Chan point out in a forthcoming article, migrant labor programs effectively, quote, enact racialized forms of governing and disciplining migrant labor through seemingly raceless mechanisms such as the denial of political and economic rights, the denial of citizenship, spatial segregation, restrictions on territorial movement and movement within the labor market, family separation, and prohibition of intimate sexual relations, end of quote. I said earlier that I see two dimensions to the hardening of citizenship on the outside. The second dimension of the hardening has to do with re-nationalization or re-racialization of citizenship. This is happening now in many Western countries, including Canada, including several other countries that have previously described themselves as multicultural societies. We see this hardening in the form of re-nationalization and re-racialization of citizenship taking several different forms. First, we can argue that it comes out in the debates we have seen, especially since the post 9/11, since the September 11th, 2001, on debates on multiculturalism. Second, I would say that in the Canadian context, there have been many very explicit references in recent years by the Canadian government to Canada as mainly a British, Christian, and royalist country. This, of course, excludes not just many immigrants from true full belonging in Canadian society, but it also includes many legal citizens of Canada and some legal citizens who have been in Canada for a long time, such as Indigenous peoples and the Quebecois. In addition to this kind of language, I would say that new citizenship rules, laws, guides and tests in recent years, they seem to emphasize a re-racialized notion of Canada. It is important to recognize that, I mean, it's easy to blame some of the shifts in definitions of Canada on the Conservative government. It is important to recognize, however, that the shift is not just coming from the Conservatives, but also from Liberals. For example, in relation to what are considered to be the national values or the regional values of a society, both in Europe as well as in Quebec, for example, through some of the discussions on the Quebec Charter and so on, we find that the references made to so-called Canadian values are often assuming that the country, the region, or the province have already achieved a consensus and accomplishments over women's rights as well as LGBT rights. There is now a growing literature on what is happening to Canada, especially since 2009, in relation to some of the rules of citizenship, some of the tests of citizenship, the guides used to train newcomers for citizenship tests, and so on. All of these changes have been taking place, and they are justified by the Canadian government in the name of strengthening Canadian citizenship, thickening Canadian citizenship with so-called Canadian values. The Citizenship Guide in Canada since 2009 has been giving more emphasis to the military as a major institution of Canadian society, to the monarchy as a very respectable institution that is associated with Canada. And it also makes certain claims to equality and nonviolence as accomplished goals and as central Canadian values that are often juxtaposed to the so-called barbaric values of other societies. Changes have also been introduced to some of the rules and ceremonies of citizenship. There has been a tightening of language tests. There are more and more difficult citizenship tests that are being introduced, which seem to exclude increasing numbers of people, especially those people who may be less educated. There's a whole emphasis by the government on the necessity of a crackdown on fraudulent acquisition of Canadian citizenship. There is also a tendency to encourage presence of military personnel in citizenship ceremonies and so on. The recently proposed Bill C-24, I mean, it was just proposed in February. The bill is called Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act. The bill not only confirms and tries to advance the toughness of some recent rules and regulations surrounding citizenship, but it also has been rather controversial in giving the government some unprecedented powers to define what we can call a conservative version of Canadian citizenship for all Canadians. In the name of strengthening Canadian citizenship, the government gives itself some what can be considered rather arbitrary powers. So for citizens who may have dual citizenship, the government now is proposing to give itself the power to revoke or strip citizenship, even of not only of naturalized citizens, but also those born in Canada. And this is something that could happen for the first time in Canadian history. So if people are found guilty on the grounds of terrorism, espionage, or treason, it seems that the government has the power, or will have the power, to strip them of citizenship. These terms, the terms terrorism, espionage, and treason may sound rather straightforward, but if you look at some of the practices in Canadian history, you find that the terms are actually extremely open-handed, and they may pose a very dangerous kind of a dangerous threat to the rule of law. When we look at some of the history of large numbers of people, specifically communists, socialists, and labor activists, deported from Canada in the 1920s and 30s, we see the ways in which some of these accusations can easily be used by governments to get rid of citizens who may who may identify themselves with some oppositional politics. Now, after talking a little bit on the hardening of citizenship on the outside, I want to refer to a few ways in which citizenship also seems to be hardening on the inside. It is useful to see that there is perhaps a connection between the physical and symbolic walls between built around nation-state boundaries in the current period and the proliferation of gated communities internally. Gated communities may seem like a benign development, but they actually signify something quite significant in terms of the breaking down of ties of solidarity on the part of nation states. There are a number of significant ways in which citizenship is hardening in the current period in the inside. First, we can argue that there has been a thinning of the freedoms, rights, and social solidarity that citizenship has historically, or at least in the post-war period, been defined by. The thinning of citizenship seems to be occurring in a number of different ways. First, and this is the one that's perhaps best covered in the academic literature, there has been a very significant decline in social rights of citizenship with the dismantling of the welfare state and the introduction of austerity measures in a number of different countries. Secondly, in addition to a thinning or weakening of social rights of citizenship, we can argue that civil rights of citizenship have significantly weakened in the post-9/11 period, in a time of heightened securitization of the state. The introduction of workfare in many Western states represents a return to the logic of a pre-20th century British poor laws. And it also represents an attack simultaneously on both the social and civil rights of citizenship. The assaults on the poor have been enabled by a wedge created by neoliberal and conservative politicians into any sense of solidarity that might have existed among working class people. Many politicians, including some in Canada, have tried to develop a language of a distinction between the so-called hardworking working class on the one hand and the non-working poor who are the welfare recipients. The ideological separation between these categories has helped undermine the sense of solidarity that supported the welfare state, as it has helped normalize and legitimize forms of unfree labor. Kenan Malik argues in relation to workfare that what workfare truly seeks to change are not people's values, but their expectations. It is a policy, he says, that makes low-paid, non-unionized jobs socially acceptable and declares those who refuse to take such jobs to be immoral. Malik continues by saying that it is the real impact of workfare is not in creating jobs or changing the lives of the poor, but rather in shifting the blame for poverty and unemployment onto the poor and the unemployed themselves. A third dimension of thinning on the inside of citizenship I want to discuss has to do with the decline I see in the political rights of citizenship. One important dimension of this has to do with the fact that with corporate neoliberal globalization, citizens of countries are losing popular sovereignty to make and influence decision making in a number of important areas. Another important dimension of the weakening of political rights of citizenship has to do with the delegitimization and marginalization of struggles by equality-seeking groups. In the Canadian context, Janine Brodie has argued as early as the 1990s that some of the substantive and more critical demands of the women's movement have become delegitimized by right-wing populist politicians who started calling equality-seeking groups special interest groups and juxtaposing them to the so-called ordinary Canadians. What do we make of these simultaneous processes of hardening that is happening to citizenship, both in the inside and the outside? Are these developments just happening simultaneously and in parallel with one another, or can we rather talk about a relationship between the hardening on the outside and hardening on the inside? I would like to suggest that there is a relationship perhaps between the two. Some studies have actually shown some of the ways in which the two may work together. I already made a reference to Grace Chang's book, Disposable Domestics, published in the year 2000, where Chang talks about the proposals by the Republicans in the United States to replace illegal immigrant workers, with U.S. citizens who are welfare recipients, so that workfare can take the place of the work done by so-called illegal immigrant workers. These proposals are actually very much on the agenda, and if you check any of the literature by the Green Party, you find that there are some very explicit calls to replacing illegal immigrants with those who are on social assistance. These proposals tend to hit basically two birds with one stone. They target two main enemies of conservatives in the American society: illegal immigrants on the one hand, and those on social assistance on the other hand, both seen as undeserving criminals who are indebted to society and who therefore need to be disciplined or punished somehow. In addition to Chang's work, there are political analyses and observations, especially in recent years, specifically in the European context, which link the rise of ultra-nationalist and neo-fascist movements and parties in Europe to the politics of austerity that seems to be in effect at the moment. I want to suggest, however, that we need to understand the political and ideological implications of this simultaneous hardening of citizenship in the inside and in the outside, not just by looking at extremist ultra-right-wing political groups, but also by looking into the impacts of the simultaneity of this hardening on the political mainstream. I want to suggest that overall, the impact of simultaneous thinning and hardening of citizenship in the inside and outside seems to be in the form of depoliticization and de-democratization of citizenship altogether. Why and how? Why am I talking about the depoliticization and de-democratization of citizenship? I want to use that term scarcification of citizenship once again. I want to suggest that scarcification of the status, rights, and identity of citizenship for immigrants, especially racialized immigrants from the global south, the very precariousness and insecurities that have been created around citizenship on the part of many immigrants, especially the racialized immigrants, seem to be leading, ironically, to an exaltation of citizenship altogether. What is happening, I suggest, is that immigrants are expected, perhaps more so than ever before, to conduct themselves as indebted, grateful subjects. Grateful, ironically, for a shrinking, precarious, and insecure citizenship. There seems to be an environment where compulsory indebtedness is expected of immigrants. And at the expense of being rather controversial, I will suggest that such compulsory gratitude is expected even from immigrants who have come to some very high positions in Canadian society. I want to read a quotation from the former Governor General, Michaëlle Jean, when she started wearing the military garb in several public ceremonies as she was acting as the Governor General. She made a speech to members of the Canadian Armed Forces in Halifax in June of 2009. In this speech, she said, "I would like to begin by confiding something to you. I grew up under the yoke of a ruthless dictatorship where the military uniform came to symbolize the brutal repression of the people, tyranny, and massacres. Since becoming Commander-in-Chief of the Canadian Forces, I have had the opportunity to work alongside you, the women and men of this country who don the uniform. I have visited your places of work. I have seen you in action. You can see how far I have come, from child who saw her parents, her family, her friends grappling with the horrors of oppression, to the woman who stands before you today. And I can say before you now with absolute certainty that it is an honor and a source of great pride for me to wear the uniform." Well, you may say, why do you problematize this quotation? We can have a conversation on that in more detail later. But when some of the operations of the Canadian Armed Forces, not just in Afghanistan, but also in Michael Jean's own home country of Haiti has been rather contentious, it's interesting that she feels rather obliged to express her full gratitude to the difference that the Canadian military makes in the world. When there is such compulsory gratitude expected of immigrants, especially racialized immigrants, the cost of ingratitude on the part of racialized immigrants, especially those who assume that they can freely exercise political rights of citizenship, to criticize some Canadian state policies, especially becomes dangerous. And we have seen this very clearly when Sunira Tobani made a speech criticizing the Canadian foreign policy in the post-9/11 period, when she was severely targeted by the media, by politicians, as well as by members of the public who sent death threats to her. The scarcification, precariousness, and insecurity of the citizenship of those who are not seen as part of the national body politics do seem to have an impact on those who are seen to be part of citizenship proper. If immigrants and newcomers are expected to demonstrate gratitude, Canadian citizens proper are expected to feel privileged and culturally superior. And they are supposed to feel this way, expected to feel this way, at the very moment they also experience a decline in their citizenship. Exaltation of so-called Canadian values or Western values have often gone hand in hand with policies that undermine those very same values. So during the so-called war on terror, the claim that Western values are about freedom and democracy has taken place as the very same, the very reality of civil liberties being attacked in the name of a war on terror. We have also seen that discourses on women's rights as part of Canadian rights or as Western values ring rather hollow, as the combined effects of neoliberalism and neoconservatism and securitization, militarization have led to a retreat for women in Canadian society as well as in some other Western societies. There has been a retreat from some of the gains made by the women's movement in the 1970s and the 1980s. I suggest that the current exaltations of citizenship, expecting gratitude from immigrants and a smug sense of cultural superiority from Canadian citizens, are both politically crippling. As such, they tend to create subjects rather than citizens, as they lead to disciplining and depoliticization of both the inside and the outside of citizenship. If what we understand by citizenship is a democratic subjectivity to struggle for a better, more egalitarian and just society, the current exaltations of citizenship, I believe, only lead to a chronic anemia, not strengthening of citizenship. Thank you.